So here is the schedule for today's lecture. And we will first have some easy task to have a recap of the experiment. And this is something that we were supposed to do during the lecture, but because of the glitch of the experiment, we just wait till today to have a very brief recap. Because since we have conducted the experiment, and also some of you already earned some money, and we need to truly utilize this opportunity to learn something important from this experiment. And we'll just have a brief discussion on what we could learn from the experimental result. And then we'll have a brief seminar to discuss the organizational behavior under environmental turbulence, especially under COVID, right? So it's a very unpredicted event that influences the whole economy across the world and many industries. And then we'll have a brief summary of this module, this course, and then we'll discuss some of the exam information. And in case you have any questions, I will take questions towards the end about the exam and also all the corresponding concept covered in this course, right? So that's today's plan. And let's first have some review of this experiment. So we will go through the 4 tasks that you have completed in this experiment and discuss what you can learn from it, right? So here is one task. So this is called bound task. Basically, you have a number of squares there, and you know that one of the square has a bond behind it, and the other squares have money. So what you need to do is to decide to collect some of the monies and at the same time to avoid the bond, right? So just think about what was your strategy there and how you can maximize your payoff, right? So we will just keep this in mind, and we will come back to discuss the implications of this task. And then we have this investment task. So basically you have 7 investment opportunities, and the outcome of the opportunity of the investment will be random. It depends on a random draw of the random number drawn by the computer. And basically with 50% of the probability, you receive one outcome, and with the other 50% probability, you have another event. So as you can see here, different investment opportunities will give you different variance of the outcomes. Suppose if you choose investment A, that's a safe investment because you can receive 210 francs for sure. And as you go down through the list, you will be able to earn a higher outcome if the event, or say the outcome is a good, or say if the investment is a successful, right? But on the other hand, if you have an unsuccessful investment, meaning the event A happens, then you will receive a lower outcome. So depending on your risk preferences, you may just go for the sure return, or you could just take the risk, right? So that you are able to receive a high outcome, but you bear the risk that in the case that the event is not good, then you receive a low outcome. Right? So this is just a task that is related to your risk preferences, how willing you are to take risks. So that's the second task. And then the third task is something that we have already discussed briefly, is basically the oil field problem. You have a field, and at each spot of this field, you will be able to try to find the oil there, right? So depending on the storage of the oil, you will be able to receive different level of payoffs. And your goal is, of course, over this, I think it's 20 rounds, try to collect as much oil as possible, or try to maximize your payoff over this 20 period of time, right? So as we mentioned, this is related to ambidexterity, because here you need to have a good balance between exploration and exploitation. You need to first explore the field so that you have an idea of the distributions of the payoffs, but at the same time, you need to exploit your knowledge of the field after you get some knowledge in order to maximize your payoff. And then we have the fourth task, the multi-arm bandit problem. Basically, we have 5 different alternatives. and you have 30 periods or 30 opportunities to choose among these 5 different opportunities, different alternatives. And your goal, of course, is to maximize your payoff over this lifespan, 30 periods. And for each alternative, there is a certain payoff related to this alternative and follow a certain distribution. Right? And again, this is related to this trade-off between exploration and exploitation, because you need to first understand this corresponding distribution of the payoffs based on your experience. You need to draw from these different alternatives and to have an idea of the distribution of the payoff behind each alternative. And after you get some of the knowledge, you need to use that knowledge and to maximize your payoff in later periods. Right? So that's the 4 tasks. So try to think about what was your strategy there and what is a good strategy there in these 4 tasks. Or at the same time, think about, are there some common features among these 4 different tasks? Right, so give you maybe 30 seconds to think about, right? So we have bond task, investment task, oil field problem, and multi-arm bandit problem, right? So what are the common features of these tasks or problems? We have 4 of them. If you have, some of you have comments, just please unmute yourself and give some comments. Or otherwise, I just want you to think so that you could learn some valuable lessons from this experiment. I mean, of course, there are a lot of things that are common, also a lot of things that are different. But what, so a little bit.
So you were saying for the first example that the numbers were, or the profits were given randomly. But in the oil field problem, for example, you'd have to use the knowledge that you've gained before to get to an optimal outcome.
Yeah. So I did not get the first part because I got that connection. What the first sentence is that? Sorry.
That the first one was given randomly, the money, and you couldn't use any kind of knowledge because you didn't have any influence on the outcome. But
the oil field problem, you have some knowledge, right? So this the payoff is certain, as you can say. That your
influence the payoff at least.
Yeah. So yeah, that's exactly true. In the bandit problem, the payoff follows certain distribution. You do not know for sure what payoff you're going to get. But for the oil field problem, if you checked, if some of you have checked the same spot on the oil field, you will notice that the payoff is exactly the same. It does not change over time. But for the bandit problem, even if you collect the same alternative, the payoff may vary over time. So that's the difference, right? But what I would argue here is that for both of these problems, you could exploit your knowledge once you get some knowledge through exploration. Because for the oil field problem, you need to search through this oil field in order to know the certain payoff on each spot. And of course, the adjacent spot, the spots that are near each other, they are likely to have similar payoff, right? So your knowledge on one spot would also influence your knowledge on this adjacent, on the nearby spot. So that's why it is a problem of exploration and exploitation, right? So you need to explore in order to have an idea of the payoff on this oil field. And after you get some knowledge, you need to know how to exploit that knowledge so that you can maximize your payoff over the longer period of time. And for bandit problem, even though this corresponding payoff after each alternative is random, but it follows some distribution. If you check closely, the payoffs from the same alternative, they are at least correlated. They follow the same distribution. So that means if you try one alternative and you gain some experience, you will have more information on the average payoff of this alternative. So that means if you keep trying to collect the same alternative, then you will get more knowledge on this alternative. So try to relate this with innovation, right? So if you keep on the same path, if you want to, for example, to invent these vaccines for COVID, and you try to either mRNA or this some other alternatives, if you keep the same path, then you will get more knowledge on this path, right? But at the same time, you probably want to explore a little bit about these other alternatives. And the more you explore, the more knowledge you get for a certain alternative. And after you get some knowledge, then it is the case that you need to exploit that knowledge, right? So that's why, even though they are these two problems, bandit and oil field problem, they are very different, because for the alternative behind this bandit problem here, the payoffs is random. And for oil problem, at each spot, this corresponding payoff is certain. But the common feature of these two problems is that you need to have a good balance between exploration and exploitation. The reason you need to explore to get knowledge is because you know nothing about this, either the oil field or the payoff behind these different bandits before you get into the field. It's exactly the same as innovation. Before you're doing anything, you know nothing about this corresponding payoff that you will be able to get, right? So you have to get some knowledge to explore before you can exploit that knowledge. Well, the first two problems, the bomb task and the investment task, they are different, because there you have enough information to know the distribution of the payoffs. So what I would argue is that in the first two tasks, the probability distribution of the payoff is known, right? So you can just, based on your preferences, whether you want to take more risk to determine what kind of decision you will make. Well, for the last two problems, this bandit problem and oil field problem, it is the case that there is a lot of uncertainty, right? So here, uncertainty is different than risk. In the first two tasks, there is a risk involved, meaning that you know the distribution and you will be able to maximize your expected payoff if you want, because you know the payoff follows certain distribution. You can do some calculation, right? Even though there is some randomness involved, but you have enough information. But in the last two tasks, just like innovation, there is a strong uncertainty. You do not know about anything of this inherent problem. You have to explore to get this knowledge first. So this distribution of the payoff can be considered as part of your knowledge, right? You need to first get some information on the distribution of the payoff in order to make a well-informed decision, right? So in order to understand the difference between these two tasks, the two types of tasks, the risks and uncertainties, let me just go through these two tasks involves risk first, and then these two tasks involving uncertainty. Right? So the bomb task, as I mentioned, you will be able to calculate the expected payoff depending on how many boxes you collect. Right? So you can know for sure that if you do not collect any box, then your payoff is definitely zero, because you do not collect any valuable boxes. But if you collect all the boxes, then your payoff is also for sure zero, because you will definitely collect the bomb, because one of the squares would have a bomb behind it. Then your payoff is completely destroyed. Your payoff is zero. So if you calculate this, then this corresponding expected payoff will be a function. It's actually inverted U-shaped function of the boxes collected. If you collect zero, the payoff is zero. If you collect all of these boxes, the corresponding payoff is also zero. And if you calculate the expected payoff, the decision that could maximize the expected payoff is just to collect half of the boxes, right? So we have 36 squares, then you can collect 18. And then that is the case, you maximize your expected payoff. But of course, the expected payoff is not the payoff that you will eventually get, because there is some randomness behind this decision making, right? So if you get lucky, then even if you collect like 23 or 33 or 34 boxes, you will be able to avoid the bomb, but that's related to luck, right? So even though here the box is collected, would determine the expected payoff, and the number 18 would maximize the expected payoff. Whether you will choose to collect 18 boxes would depend on your risk preferences. If you just want to get something for sure, then you will collect a fewer number of squares, right? So because in this case, the variance of the payoff would be small, and it's likely that you will get at least get some positive payoff, right? So this is something that you know the probability distribution, and you can calculate the expected payoff. The same applies for the investment task. So we have 7 investment opportunity, and for 50% of probability, you get one outcome. For the other 50%, you get the other outcome. And here, if you calculate the expected payoff for this different investment, can be calculated exactly, right? So if you want to maximize your expected payoff, and the investment probability that is best is probably investment 5, right? So because here the expected payoff is maximized, and also at the same time the variance is smaller than in opportunities 6 and 7. So in finance, the variance of the payoff can be defined as risk, right? So if the variance is 0, like investment opportunity 1, you will receive this payoff for sure. There's no variance, there's no risk involved. But if you have a gamble or an investment that have a large variance, so that means you have a higher risk involved there. So if your goal is to maximize your expected payout, then opportunity 5 is the best opportunity, right? And of course, if you want to play it for sure, to get something for sure, then you probably would go for investment 1. So there's no best investment opportunity in this case, because it would determine by your risk preferences how certain you want your payoff to be. But what I can tell you that if you are risk neutral, meaning that you are willing to bear the risk, then maximizing the expected payoff may be a good option. Suppose you do not take this investment tax just once, you take it for 100 times, right? In that case, you have this risk that distributed across this investment tax. In that case, it is actually a good decision to maximize your expected payoff. If you play it once, of course, if you do not want to end up with very unlucky outcome, you can choose this the first certain outcome, right? So if you take it once, to summarize, the opportunity that you want to make depends on your risk preferences. But if you take this opportunity for a large number of times, then it is a good strategy to maximize your expected payout. So that is the 2 tasks that involves risk. You can exactly calculate this corresponding expected payoff. So even though there is some randomness involved in the eventual payoff you receive, you have some confidence, you have a lot of information on the likely outcome you would receive. But when you go to the oil field problem, it's very different, because before you check any point, you know nothing, right? I did not tell you anything in this experiment. And that is the goal of this experiment. So here is actually the distribution of the payoffs, right? So, and you see here, you definitely could get some information on the payoffs by checking this adjacent spot, because points or locations that are near each other, they are likely to have the similar payoffs. But the landscape is rugged, right? So even though there's some information, but because it's very rugged, these up and downs very dramatically, it is not possible to get good information, right? So you can get some information, but it's not easy to get good information there. So that's the oil field problem. So here I can tell you that the peak occurs at the coordinate 70 here on the x-axis, and 37 on the y-axis, and the maximum payoff is 46, right? I don't know how many of you have achieved this maximum payoff. It's very hard, right? Without any information I tried, I mean, I could not get the maximum payoff. And that is the case for innovation. It's really hard for a short period of time to get the maximum payoff. But what you want to do from innovation is that you get some reasonably good result that is better than your competitors. Then that's the key to success of your business, right? So innovation does not require you to get the best outcome, the most efficient outcome, but you need to do it better than others so that you can create more value, right? So this is the oil field problem. And then the bandit problem. So you see here, these are the payoffs of different alternatives over time, right? So we have 5 different alternatives and we have different color. As you can see here, this corresponding payoff would follow some distribution, right? And I will show you the distribution later. It's actually followed normal distribution. But what is interesting to observe here is that we have 5 different alternatives. And at first, this blue one, so this blue one, I call it alternative 1. The average payoff is kind of low, right? But over time, the payoff changes. The alternative 1 was the worst outcome, or close to the worst alternative in the beginning, but over time, it actually gained some advantage. I don't know how many of you noticed that this underlying distribution or the relative expected payoff of this different alternative actually change over time. So this is related to the observation that in our business world, there will be some turbulence that make once obsolete or once bad alternative, bad technology become the dominant technology that is preferred by the customers. But if you're too focused on your current technology, it is hard to discover this change, right? So it is easy for you to miss this change opportunity, to grasp this opportunity that is against this dominance, right? So that's the underlying payoffs for this problem. And now we can have some brief discussion. What is a good strategy? We already mentioned you should have a good balance between exploration and exploitation. You need to find some knowledge, right, first, and then try to exploit that knowledge for the oil problem and for the bandit problem. But now this question I want to ask is, do you expect exploration increase or decrease over time? So this should be a straightforward question for you. And I'm expecting an answer, right? So if you know the answer, please unmute yourself and tell me, do you expect exploration or say the accumulation of knowledge or your effort to get knowledge decrease or increase over time? Emil?
I think it decreases because you get comfortable. Like, for example, with the payout, you think that's the good payout and then you just keep going.
Yeah, it's a good observation, right? So let's see later whether it is consistent with this conjecture. So I'll show you the experimental result, what you did, right? And to see whether this exploration would decrease over time as expected. So if it is indeed the case, then it could explain the phenomena that new firms are usually more likely to explore, right? Because when they come into this industry, they know nothing. And so that's why they will explore more. And it's actually also the case that when you're a new baby, right? So you know nothing about the world, anything you do is actually exploration. When you have zero knowledge, anything you do is by definition exploration. But when you gain more knowledge, then it is the tendency to exploit that knowledge, of course, would increase. And also it's not easy for you to get new knowledge as before, right? So this is telling us that there are some factors that would influence one's tendency to explore. The first one is the time span. If you are sure that your knowledge can be only used for short term, then you will probably not explore that much. You will not try to get new knowledge. Suppose you are visiting a city for example, and you want to try the good restaurant. You have 7 days, then for the first or 2 days, you probably would try different restaurants for different meal. But towards the end, when you are about to leave the city, you will probably not to try to explore new opportunities. You will just try the old restaurant that you know for sure is good, because towards the end of this time spent, the benefit of further exploring is much lower than before, right? So that's why you see the old people, when they're getting old, they will try to recall their old memories, because in this case, they have a lot of knowledge, they want to exploit that knowledge. So this time spent is something that would influence your tendency to explore or to exploit. And also uncertainty related to the different alternatives is also one factor that would influence your tendency for exploration. So this is something that is not touched upon in our experiment. But for example, in some cases, the return from one alternative or for one technological path is very uncertain. So today you get negative, tomorrow you get 1,000, a very good outcome. And you need, in that case, the uncertainty involved is high, then you need to explore more to reduce that uncertainty. Right? So these are the two factors that would influence one's tendency to explore. And let's just get back to look at the experiment result and see whether the result is consistent with what Emil have conjectured. So here is the exploration over time. So how do we define exploration? I mean, one easy way is to define exploration as you check a location in the oil field problem that is different from the previous one, right? So this is a very rough definition for exploration. And maybe a better definition is that to check the distance between the new spot that you checked with all the other spots that you have checked, right? So, and get the minimum distance. So either these two definitions is fine, right? It's a definition for exploration, whether you're gaining new knowledge, right? Using both of these definitions, you will see that the exploration rate over time is decreasing, just as we expected, right? So that means as participant, you know that towards the end of this experiment, the benefit of further exploring is much lower than before, right? So this is the exploration over time in the oil field problem. If you check this multi-unbounded problem, you will have the same tendency. The exploration is keep decreasing. And here exploration, you can just define it as whether you choose the same action as before. At the beginning, the exploration is very high, meaning that most of you would try to check different alternatives, right? But as time passes by, you will be more likely to stick to the same alternative because you already have enough knowledge that you can explore this knowledge to maximize your payoff. And as I mentioned, for the multi-unbounded problem, these payoffs for different alternatives would follow this certain distribution. But for one of the alternatives, which is this alternative one, it actually moves across time to mimic this idea that in this business world, sometimes this alternative, some type of technology may become dominant over time, even though at the start, it does not give you a good return, right? So one thing that I have tested in the experiment is the idea of learning curve, right? So you may be wondering why we call this exercise as experiment. Because in the experiment, you usually have different treatments. You have a treated group, and at the same time, you have a control group. And you randomize this participant into these two different groups to test the treatment effect, right? And it's actually the case for our experiment. For the multi-unbounded problem, you were actually randomly assigned into two different conditions, or say two different treatment. One treatment, half of you are assigned to this problem without learning curve, and the other half were assigned to the problem with learning curve. And if you still remember, learning curve, as we mentioned when we talk about the boundary of the organizations, is that when you gain experience, this corresponding implementation cost or the cost of using that technology would decrease, right? So meaning that you become more proficient and more efficient in using that technology or using that corresponding alternative. So in the treatment, in the condition where learning curve exists, this corresponding each alternative has an implementation cost. And this implementation cost will decrease with the experience. Right? So here is the definition or the curve of this learning cost. And as you can see here, when the experience doubles, for example, if you have chosen this corresponding alternative 20 times, then this implementation cost would be 80% of the implementation cost when you have only chosen it for 10 times, meaning that when the experience doubles, this learning cost would reduce by 20%. So this is something that actually has been documented in the literature, right? So in most industries, this type of learning curve is documented, is observed from data. So now the question I want to ask you, and this is a question that I want you to think more about it. Under what condition do you expect participants more likely to find the optimal choice in the changing environment? Let me just try to remind you that here we have this alternative one. At first, it was a bad outcome, a bad alternative, but eventually it became the best alternative. So the question I'm asking is, under what condition, with or without learning curve, do you expect participants, you expect yourself and other classmates would be more likely to find the optimal choice? Is the question clear? Elizabeth?
I would say that I think the probability is higher when you have no prejudice. So when it's randomly.
Yeah.
So without the learning curve. Without
learning curve, yeah, it's exactly what I'm expecting. Because when you have learning curve, that means if you try one alternative, your payoff from that alternative will be increasing, right? But you may be mistaken that increase in payoff as the payoff from the technology would increase, but it's actually from your learning curve. But it's hard for you to tell. And because of this learning curve, it is likely that you will stick to your old alternative for your old technology because you have polished your skills or your experiences of using one technology, then your payoff from that technology is higher because of this learning curve, then you are more likely to stick to that alternative. And let's see whether this is the case. And this is what we can observe from the experimental data. So here we have two different treatments, and we just separated by this treatment. And what is shown is over time, what is the probability or the percentage of the choices that has chosen this corresponding optimal choice, right? So at the start, the optimal choice is actually alternative 5, and eventually it would become the alternative 5. At the start is the alternative 5, but eventually it would become alternative 1, right? And as you can see here at the start, there's not a dramatic difference, but eventually you will see these participants without learning curve, they are more likely to discover this new best alternative, right? And of course, you have only 10 participants in each group. I did not test statistical significance. It just to show you this tendency, right? So there is a tendency that when you have this learning curve, you are more likely to stick to this corresponding alternative that you have chosen before. And the following graph actually shows the same thing. So this graph actually shows the distribution of different alternatives, right? So just let me remind you, this alternative 5 is the best alternative in the beginning, and alternative 4 is the second best. And then the other 3 were more or less similar. But eventually, as time goes by, alternative 1 becomes the best alternative. So these are the distribution of the outcome over time. So this is the first 10 period, and then the second 10 periods, and the last 10 periods, right? So what we can observe is the difference between these 2 treatments is that, at least towards the end, right? So you see here more participants without learning curve, they are likely to discover this best outcome, which is alternative 1. And another interesting observation is that much more participants in the learning curve treatment, they are likely to stick to the second best alternative here, right? Because it's kind of like a path dependence. If you have chosen alternative 4 at the start and did not explore that much with alternative 5, because of the learning curve, you will be mistakenly think that alternative 4 is actually a good outcome, right? So with learning curve, it's actually more likely for you to get stuck into the alternative that you have chosen before. So that is the lesson we could learn from this experiment. And hopefully you can relate these outcomes of your own behavior with the innovation phenomena that you could observe in the business world, right? Any questions or comments on the experiment? Okay, so if no question, we will go to the next topic. And as you can see, this next topic is actually related to the experimental result. Although ideally, I would want the experimental result to be discussed right after the experiment, but it's actually fit very well to the topic that we will discuss, which is the how environmental turbulence influence the organizational behavior, and how organizations and what type of organizations could exhibit resilience in the presence of environmental turbulence so that it could achieve this dynamic capability, right? So here is the question that I want you to think about. How can organizations deal with the environmental turbulence? I mean, one great example of this turbulence, it would be this pandemic, the COVID pandemic, right? And it has the great influence on businesses. And not only the business, you see that the GDP growth, which is the aggregate measure of the conditions of the soundness of the business world, is dramatically influenced by the COVID situation. And we may be asking, when faced with this extreme uncertainty, what type of organizations are more likely to survive and thrive at the same time? Right? So this is the question that I want to think about. And we will base this discussion on one paper that we will discuss, but let me just give you some examples. You know what is the best restaurant in the world? The Danes probably know, and the Noma is actually one restaurant in Copenhagen, and it has been ranked as the #1 restaurant for many years. I mean, sometimes it's dropped from #1, but it's close to the top. And Noma was very popular, has already also been very popular now, a restaurant, but it was greatly influenced by the COVID shutdown, right? Now, you know, Denmark is completely open, but in 2020, it has this closed down that all restaurants has to be closed. I mean, they cannot take customers. You can have takeaway, but the customer cannot get into the restaurant or dine in the restaurant. So how can restaurant cope with this situation, right? So you may think that Noma, as the Michelin star restaurant, very high-class, fancy restaurant, it would be very hard for it to adjust to the situation. But it turns out that they actually come up with something very genius to cope with the situation, and they actually have a great reception from the customers. Is they actually change their business scope. They are still restaurant, but they change what is the serve as food, and they actually started to have these takeaways. And let's just watch this this video and just part of it, and to have a taste of what Noma did to cope with this turbulence.
This cheeseburger looks simple, but hundreds of people have waited up to 3 hours to get one. That's because it's served at Copenhagen's famed Noma.
Here in Denmark, everybody knows that Noma is one of the best restaurants in the world.
Like many restaurants, Noma shut its doors for a few months and reopened in May in an entirely new way.
When I heard that they were reopening as a burger bar, it was very unexpected. I think a lot of us have the association with Noma that it's very fine dining experience. It's very closed off from the rest of Copenhagen in a way.
Customers like Caroline waited in line to order burgers to go or to eat in a picnic area outside the restaurant.
We sold 1,300 burgers in about 4 hours. It was amazing. We may have had 1,000 people line up at first.
Yeah, it was almost like Star Wars when Star Wars movies came out, and then if you hadn't gone, that was not okay.
There's just 2 burgers on the new menu, 1 meat and 1 veggie. The Noma cheeseburger is called the Viking. It's made with dry-aged flank steak and seasoned with beef garum, which is a fermented beef glaze made from a mix of beef, salt, water, barley, and koji. Executive chef Rene Redzepi and his team blend in beef kidney fat to give the meat an even beefier flavor. Chefs slap the ground meat between their hands to mold each patty into a round shape. Then it's cooked with butter and topped with organic cheddar cheese, red onion, and a burger sauce that's made with mayo, ketchup, and pickles. The veggie burger is made with quinoa and tempeh and glazed with a mix of fermentation liquids.
Oh my god, it's so buttery, right? And it's like a fluffy bun. There's creamy kind of sauce. You have some lettuce. Don't dissect the burger.
Okay, I think that's enough, and you get the idea of what the change of business scope. I mean, it's really hard to connect these burgers, which is considered as fast food, with a high-end Michelin star restaurant. But that's what Noma did. So they try to adjust their scope of business so that they could adjust to this turbulence, right? So there's just be creative in what you do in order to adjust to the change in the environment. And another example that I want to show you is what Tesla did I think it's in 2018, right? So they have this high demand for this new model, but their production was lagging behind. So what they did, what Elon Musk did, is just to try to construct a very huge tent, which the area of 2 soccer field, I think. And they just put these production lines inside this tent and keep producing, and they actually meet this this surging demand. And it's actually quite creative, meaning that when you face this uncertainty, then you could be able to come up with some genius ideas. Just use your creativity in order to cope with this changing environment. Right. So a lot of the business, they have this problem of this ramp-up problem, that this high demand in the customer side could not be matched by the production. But Tesla come up with this very genius idea, right? To use something that unconventional in order to cope with this this idea, this turbulence. Yeah, it looks delicious. I see the chat. I mean, after watching the video of Noma, I become hungry again, even though I had a breakfast. So as the last example, let's just try to look at what these some of the companies did during COVID. So these are 2 companies, actually automotive manufacturers in China. The one is called BYD, and I mean, this company is actually also leading in producing electric cars in China. But during the COVID time, they decided to start producing face masks, right? And it is the same for this joint venture between GM and Shanghai Automobile Industry Corporation and the Wuling. So this is, you just need to know that it's a joint venture, and it's actually a Chinese company, car manufacturer company, and they also change their scope of business to produce face masks. And here, the Chinese know what it is. It says that whatever the people need, we will produce. Right? So it's just an example to show that some of the companies, they are willing to change their scope of business in order to cope with this corresponding environmental turbulence in the business world. So the questions that I want to ask is, are these companies that they have this change in business scope do better than the other organizations in terms of profit, for example, in terms of how they survive or thrive in this turbulence? So what I will introduce next is just based on one paper this is a paper with Yi-Mei and also one former SDC students that is published in Management and Organization Review. So this is just basically answer the questions that I listed before. How can an organization deal with the environmental turbulence? And when faced with extreme uncertainty, what types of organization are more likely to survive and thrive? Right? So that's just some introduction, and let's just have 10 minutes a break. We will get back at 13 after the hour, and we will continue the discussion of resilience during the COVID. So here, just following what we discussed, a lot of the companies, they actually changed their business of scope during the COVID. So they started to produce this anti-epidemic products like the face masks or hand sanitizer. So here is actually the reported addition of anti-epidemic businesses between January the 1st and the 1st of May. Right? So the red one are the companies that we are considering in this paper. Is just A-share company. So A-share is actually just the most popular stock market companies, listed company in China. Right? And the other listed company, although they are public traded, you could purchase their shares, their stocks, but it's not that liquid. It's not easy to, it's not everyone can purchase, but A share is something that everybody, if you have a bank account, if you just provide some registration, then you will be able to trade this A share company. And you see here, a lot of the companies, they include or they add some of the businesses to cope with this COVID pandemic, and they started to produce this anti-epidemic businesses. Right? So here is just the corresponding occurrence of this addition of business. So the question we want to ask is just, how do the businesses or the companies, they proactively cope with COVID by adding their business scope, do better than the other companies, right? So here is just the stock market price, which is a measure of the performance that is used in most of the literature, a very common measure. So as we can see here, we have three types of businesses. The first one, we call it this resilient companies, where they actually proactively add their businesses of this anti-epidemic in their scope of business. And then we have the lucky businesses, meaning that they are actually started, they already produced this corresponding anti-epidemic products before this breakout of COVID. And then we have the other companies. As you can see here, in comparison to the other companies, both these resilient companies, they are proactively adding this business scope, and those lucky companies that they already produce these products related to the pandemic, they perform well than the other companies. But the ones that are resilient, they are proactive, they actually does better than the lucky ones, right? Even though the lucky ones, they actually already prepared to produce these products even before the outbreak. So this is demonstrates the resilience of these companies, how important it is. And now let's just focus on these 47 companies which actually have this addition of anti-dynamic business, and depending on their characteristics, how they perform, how their performance would differ. Right? So here it's just among these 47 companies that have this change of business. And we divide these companies into two groups. The first one is vertical integration. So meaning that they have research and development, they have production, they also have sales and marketing. So they have this vertical integration. And the others, they just have this specialized in one stage of the value chain. They either have research and development, and most of them just have manufacturing, and some of them have this sales and marketing, right? So as we can see here, the companies with vertical integration, they are actually more resilient to the turbulence, because you see here, there's a dramatic difference between these companies with vertical integration and the one with specialization. Now let's look at these 47 companies from another perspective. Is just this ex post adjustment. When they have this addition of anti-epidemic business, it's like what they include, what type of business they expand in their business would differ, right? Some of them, they have this adjustment, is along this research development and production and the sales, meaning that when they expand both the research, this innovation part, the production, the manufacturing, and also the sales. And some, they only change their productions, and the other, they only change sales. And we see here, if you only change sales or the marketing, it's actually perform worse than the average company, right? So if you look at this graph, so here is the stock market price at the start of the year. The other A-share companies that without the addition of business, they come back to the original stock market price, even though it's influenced by the COVID, but they come back by the end of May. But if you look at those companies, they tried to have this addition of a new scope, but they only include in the sales. They actually perform worse than the other companies on average, right? So if you want to be resilient, it also depends on what type of resilience you want. This would influence your performance. So what we can learn from this? So I want to get back to the idea of research-based view. We quickly mention this research-based view when we talk about organizational boundaries. So research-based view, or RBV for short, is just claiming that a firm can exploit these RING resources, meaning valuable, rare, imperfectly immutable, and non-substitutable. So when the firm have this type of resources, they will be able to achieve sustainable competitive advantage. And competitive advantage is the ability of a firm to outperform its industry, right? But this resource-based view, it focuses on these ordinary capabilities to exploit existing resource base for sustainable competitive advantage. So this is something that is important when there is no environmental turbulence, when the environment does not change dramatically. But when there is turbulence, these dynamic capabilities are quite important, right? So what do we mean by dynamic capabilities, or say the dynamic capabilities view? This view focuses on the issues of competitive survival in response to rapidly changing environment. So when there is rapidly change in the environment, then this dynamic capability is quite important. What do we mean by dynamic capability? How it is differ from this ordinary capability? Dynamic capability is the capability of an organization to purposefully adopt an organization's resource base. So here it just, you need to have this adaptation when there's a turbulence. You need to actively and purposefully adapt this resource base. So you do not stick to the old resource base. So this concept is first proposed by David Teese. So in their paper, they originally claimed that it is the firm's ability to integrate, to build, and to reconfigure internal and external competencies to address rapidly changing environment, right? And the concept is also extended by Eisenhardt and Martin. They say that it is the firm's processes that use resources, specifically the process to integrate, reconfigure, gain, and release resources to match and even create market change, right? So you may have the feeling that this concept of dynamic capability is similar to the concept of organizational ambidexterity that we mentioned before. And if you have that feeling, then your feeling is exactly correct. So these two concepts, dynamic capability and organizational ambidexterity, they actually refer to the same thing. It's just they proposed by different researchers so that they have different names. But in the literature in the future, if you see these two words, then you can be sure that they have very similar meaning, right? It's just dynamic capability is proposed by researcher in strategic management. So when you talk about strategy of the organizations, you talk about dynamic capability, how they cope with the environmental turbulence. But when you talk about learning, then that would be the concept of organizational ambidexterity, meaning that you learn to get the experience and also you exploit that experience to cope with the future change, right? So these two concepts are the same, right? So that's the discussion of organizational resilience and also dynamic capability. And now I guess is the part that you're most interested in is just a summary of this course to get you prepared for the exam. So here, let's just have this module summary. And first, you may ask, why do we want to have this module? Why do we have this course? I mean, you have the major of innovation management, you study innovation, and you already know that innovation is a value creation process. And then why do we need to study organization? And you see the focus of this module is to understand organization. That is because organizations and the firms in particular are the main innovation actor. So I remember I asked you the question, what is the goal of a firm or an organization in general? I mentioned the idea of value creation, right? So innovation is value creation process, and the value creation is also the goal of organization. And they have this inherent connection. So in order to understand innovation, you have to have some basic understanding of organization. So understanding organizations and how they interact with the environment and with each other is actually indispensable for us to understand innovation. That's why it is important to have this basic concept of organization to deepen your understanding of innovation. So now let's just have a review of the important concepts and theories and frameworks that we have covered so far in this course. So I will present all the theories based on organizational architecture. So this organizational architecture, it just lists all the important components of the organization that defines organization. There are 5 important components of organization. We have formal organization, informal organization, or say formal structure, informal structure. And then we have people, or you can also say human resources. And then we have work and technology for producing the products. And some researchers also call this business processes, right? So it's just to transform input to output using this technology and to finish different tasks. And the 5th important component is called strategies and goals, right? And also at the same time, even though these are the 5 important components of organization, it has to interact with the environment. And it's specifically the strategy and the goals, they are determined by the environment and also by the technology, by the human resources you have in the organization. Basically, the strategies is determined by the environment and also the resources you have or the technology you have in the organization. And now, once we have this organizational architecture, we can put all the theories into this framework, right? To have a this bird view outlook of this organizational theory. So when we look at the formal organizations, we have this formal structure. In the first session, you may talk about the organizational structures, right? So that's the formal structure. You have the functional, divisional form, and the matrix form. That's the formal structure. And this formal structure, formal organization, consider organization as a rational system. It's like a machine, right? So you have the people, you have the technology, and you transform input to output. And based on this rational system theory, we have this management theory. So from Taylor's scientific management, and then we have administrative management, and then we have a bureaucratic theory proposed by Max Weber. These are all management theory, and they all based on the assumption that organizations are rational systems. And then you still remember the idea of theory X? So we have theory X and theory Y, right? So these are how to motivate the employees, the workers in the organization. Theory X is just based on the rational system, meaning that you have to monitor the workers and give them incentives to motivate them to work, right? So, and this is also based on agency theory. So workers and managers, they may work for their own benefit, and they do, at the same time, they may sacrifice the goals of the stock, the stockholders or the owners of the company. So that's basically just the rational system theory, consider the organization as a rational system, right? And then we have this, if you look at this informal structure, then it is actually considers this organization as a natural system. Just the people get together and they have the social relationship with each other. So when we consider organization as a natural system, then we know that there are networks within this organization that is not defined by the formal organization. So you have the social relationship with your colleagues. And so that's why this organizational culture is very important. And then theory Y can be put into this natural system, meaning that the employees, they do not just work for the salary they get. They also work for some meaning. So they have some intrinsic motivation to work for the organization. And that's why it's quite important to have a good organizational culture, because this culture would actually give a clear vision and the goals to the employees so that they work not only for the money, for the salary, for the incentive, but also at the same time for this fulfillment, this sense of meaning, right? And that's why a lot of people, when they work for the startups, they have this really strong sense of fulfillment. And they, even though the salary is not high, but they work very hard and work very late in order to help the organization, the startup to succeed, to survive. Because there you have this sense of organizational culture, and that is not defined and cannot be defined by these incentives or this rational system, right? And then when we look at the environment and other components, we come to this, the most prevalent theory, which is the open system theory, which considers organization as open system. It interacts with the environment. And a lot of the things that the organization do are actually not just determined by the internal components, but determined by the environment, all right? And as you can see here, most of the theories that we have covered in this course would be based on this open system theory. And indeed, before this open system theory was proposed, there was no organization theory. There was only management theory. Right? Only when we consider the role played by the environment, we have this organization theory. And here are all the theories that we have mentioned, discussed in this course. We have transaction cost theory, right? Just try to recall what it is. We introduced the idea of asset specificity and hold-up problem, right? So these are two important concepts related to our transaction cost theory. And also the organizational boundary is determined, mainly determined by the transaction cost theory. And it is the, right, when we talk about transaction cost theory, it's mainly determined this vertical boundary, and horizontal boundary, something that determined by the technology that we'll discuss briefly later. And then we have this population ecology. So this is related to evolutionary economics. We did not expand on this, but the basic idea is that different firms will have different features, and the environment will have this selective force to select different routines done by the firms. And certain routines are actually adaptable to this current environment. And when the environment change, then different features would be selected. So that's why as the time goes by, different firms would experience this life cycle. Some firms, they do not adapt to the environment, would just die out. And the other firms that become successful because they have this certain features that is adaptable in this current environment, right? So this is just the idea, really closely related to the idea of evolutionary theory. And then we have institutional theory. So if you remember, the very important concept mentioned in institutional theory is the legitimacy, right? And also isomorphism. It explains why a lot of the organizations, they are the same, even though they try to achieve competitive advantage by getting new innovation, but a lot of the organizations, they look similar. So institutional theory or institutional logic could explain that. Legitimacy, isomorphism are two important concepts in institutional theory. And then we have resource-dependent theory. You remember the keyword for resource-dependent theory is power, or say dependence, right? So power depending determines who you are dependent on. Right? So try to recall what this theory could explain. And when you try to avoid the dependence on others, that's the case would motivate you to have vertical integration. For example, that's when your suppliers has power over you, then you are depending on your supplier. Then you probably want to have vertical integration in order to get rid of that dependence. So, for example, during the COVID time, there's a chip shortage, right? So from the Silicon Valley, so there's a very dramatic, serious shortage of chips, and a lot of the car manufacturers, they do not have enough chips in order to produce their cars, and but the companies like Tesla, it has vertical integration. It produces its own chips, and because it does not depend on the chip companies in Silicon Valley, it will be able to still keep producing their production. So because it does not depend on, because Tesla has the vertical integration, it does not depend on the Silicon Valley's company. Right? So that's resource-dependent theory, and that's why Tesla actually coped well in this chip shortage, because you are not dependent on the other company's resources. And then we have ecosystem theory. You should be able to understand why nowadays it's very common to have ecosystem. What are the advantages of ecosystem, right? And then we talk about change management. Basically, when the environment changes, these corresponding components of the organization has to change, adapt accordingly. But you know that, as we have learned from the past 3 lectures, it's not easy to change, because whenever there's some change, there will be some resistance, right? So, and you not only need to change one component, you need to change the other components accordingly. So these highlighted or theory that are in bold, these are important theory. You need to understand what they mean, this corresponding definition, and also how to apply them. What kind of phenomena can be explained by this, right? So the other things, these are also theories, but they are not in bold, so it is fine. You need to know what they mean, but you should focus on the theories that are in bold when you try to review for the exam. So these are the 3 views of organization: rational system, natural system, and open system. But in addition to that, we also cover some important concepts. For example, in the second lecture, we talk about organizational boundaries, and you should know what type of things, what factors will determine the boundaries. When we talk about the horizontal boundary, right? So we have economy of scale, economies of scope, and learning curve. This determines the horizontal boundary, and the bureaucracy cost would also partially determine the horizontal boundary. Well, when we talk about the vertical boundary, then transaction cost is the main driving factor. And even though the other factors are determined by the technology you have at the organization, but the transaction cost is determined by the environment also, right? So it's also determined by the institutions, how well the economy in a certain country would function would also determine the transaction cost. And that's why you see that in a lot of the less developed countries, it's more often to observe vertical integration of big companies because transaction costs in those countries without mature legal system is high, and that's why they have this vertical integration to reduce this transaction cost. And then we talk about, well, related to strategy and goals, we talk about the resource-based view. We use resource-based view to discuss strategic alliance and joint venture. So that's one application that we use. And also today we mentioned the resource-based view and its comparison to dynamic capabilities, right? And also we mentioned organizational ambidexterity. It has the same meaning as dynamic capability. Basically, is referring to the capability of firm to cope with this changing environment, right? So that's the overview of all the theories covered in this module. You have any questions on this? Anything is unclear? I mean, here's a chance that if you want some clarification of the concept or the theory, you can ask now. Okay, everything is clear. So everyone would get 12 in this exam, right? So good to know. I mean, so for change management, let me just have a quick review of that, because these 4 views of change process is actually related to some of the theories. So we have 4 views of the change process. The first 2 is called evolutionary theory and life cycle theory. So this is kind of related to population ecology. This is just have this idea that the change trajectories are predetermined by the environment and also by the life cycle that is inherent in the development of the firms. On the other hand, we have also here, so here is this, the life cycle that is documented for a lot of firms. So basically at the beginning, the firms are easy to, they're innovative and trying to explore, and eventually they will decline. And if they do not adapt, they will just die out and eliminated by the environment. And the other 2 types of views are, the first is a teleological theory, meaning that is the change has a certain purpose, right? So, I mean, there's a difference in the evolutionary theories that why human exists in the world. You know, some of the creationists, the people who believe in God, they have this teleological theory of why human exists, because God wants human beings to be there. That's why we exist. That is the idea of teleological theory, meaning that there's, for all kinds of things, there is a certain purpose, right? Well, the evolutionary theory is just saying that human exists because, you know, it's adapt to the environment, it eventually selected by the environment, and eventually it emerged. So this is a difference between teleological and the evolutionary theory. And also, here is an important theory and a quite interesting theory. It's called a dialectical theory. Anyone know what this word dialectic means? I mean, after learning change management, anyone can explain to me what do we mean by dialectical theory here?
Isn't it having like 2 different concepts and they are conflicting, and in between those, the best solution is found? Yeah.
Thanks, Nikolai. That's a very good explanation. I'm actually very sure that the Chinese student know this, heard this dialectical, this word in Chinese. You just do not know the English word. So, you know, this Marxism, this political economy, would call it a 辩证法. So it's just meaning that for everything, there are 2 forces that conflicting each other. In order to understand one thing, you have to understand the both sides of the thing that are contradicting with each other. So dialectical is actually from the word dialect, right? So if you speak a dialect, it's just one variation of a language, meaning that it's another way, an alternative way to speak a language. So dia meaning 2, right? So, and dialectical just meaning that there are 2 contradicting forces that determine the corresponding trajectory of this change. So here I just give you this illustration to demonstrate this. Usually you have this bad scenario, and you want to change to a good scenario, a more desirable scenario to adapt to the environment. but there are driving force that pushing you to change, but there are also restraining force that would hold you back to change. So this is related to agency theory, meaning that also there's a bureaucracy cost. When you have a big organization, different department would have different vested interests. They have their own incentives to do a certain things that would hold the change back. So think about the example of Intel, right? So when they try to cut this business of memory, instead of just focusing on producing chips, the CEOs, once they decide this change in direction, it faces this very strong restraining forces, because all the departments that are focusing on producing memories, they would definitely not want their department to be cut, right? So they would not want to change the focus. So that's the idea of this dialectical theory. I mean, the combination of a teleological theory and dialectical theory is just that teleological, meaning that the firm has certain purpose, they want to change. But at the same time, especially when you have big organizations, it is very hard to change because you will face this resistance from different departments, right? So that's just the general idea of these 4 views of change process. Right. So now let me just ask you a question. What is the difference between resource-based view and resource-dependent theory? And what kind of phenomena can they explain? This is not easy question, and you may think for a while. And if you have any idea, you can tell me. I mean, both of this, one is called a view, is not called a theory because it's how you perceive the certain phenomena, and the other is theory. But both of these words, these 2 phrases, have resource in it, right? So that's the commonality. But they are actually focusing on different things. So let me just briefly go through these 2 theories, because in the future, if you look at this, if you notice these 2 words in the literature, you know although they all refer to resources and emphasize the importance of resource, they actually focus on different things. Resource-based view, as we just have a review, its focus is on sustainable competitive advantage. So resource-based view is just trying to explain why some firms would do better than other firms, because they have this valuable, rare, and it's hard to imitate and also non-substitutable resources, right? So that's the determinants of their competitive advantage. So this is an important concept in strategic management. So in the strategic management literature, it's very easy for you to look at, to see the word resource-based view. It just, when you see the resource-based view, it's just one view that explains why some firms would do better than other firms, because they have special resources, heterogeneous resources that the other firms do not have. Right? Well, resource-dependent theory focuses on power. I mean, we talk about power all the time, but what is power? Anyone? I mean, I'll give you the answer. One answer. Of course, you can define power differently. I mean, one definition of power is the ability to accomplish goals in opposition of the intention of others. You do not need to care too much about what other people want or other people think. You can just go directly to do the things you want. That is your power, right? So we say that the government have the power because they have this police, they have the law enforcement, so that they can force you to abide by the law. Otherwise, they will put you into prison. That's against your intention. Right? So when your manager has power over you, they can ask you to do things even though you do not want. Otherwise, you will not receive any salary. I mean, the teachers, maybe it's not politically right to say, but teachers have the power over the students, because when I ask you to do certain assignment, you need to do even though you do not want to do it sometimes, because otherwise you will not have a good grade. So that's the idea of power. And resource-dependent theory focuses on power, right? So this theory is used to explain a lot of things that firms do, and they do things in order to reduce dependence on some other agents, some other partners, right? Firm can reduce the dependence on trading partners through vertical integration, long-term contracting, or joint venture and alliances. So it actually has been documented that when you have this asymmetric trading meaning that one party is more dependent on the other party, then it is more likely to have vertical merger or vertical integration. So both of these two theory, I just call them theory, even though resource-based view is just a view, they could explain why the firms would join these strategic alliances, right? From resource-based view, the two firms would form strategic alliances because they want to use these valuable resources from the other firm in order to achieve this joint competitive advantage. So think about the joint venture of these car manufacturers and the Chinese company, like Volkswagen, they want the market in China. That's a valuable resources. And the Chinese companies would want the technology from Volkswagen, from the foreign car manufacturer. So these can be explained by resource-based view. Well, resource-dependent theory could also explain why this joint venture would merge. It just, they do not want to depend on the other partners, right? And also vertical integration can also be explained by resource-dependent theory. Is it more clear now? Okay. Any questions? Okay, so if no more questions, let's just have some discussion on the exam. And so here's some basic information. On Friday, you will have 4-hour take-home assignment. All A's are allowed. You can use the internet. You can check some of the words that you do not know. You can even search for further information related to a case, because there will be some cases that you need to go through in the exam. But there's no communication is allowed, right? So you do not, you're not allowed to communicate with any other people. You should be your work independently. And in your submission, you need to indicate your student number, but do not write your name, right? So because it should be anonymous, and we want our grading to be fair. I mean, if you write your name, I will have a bad impression on you, right? Because I already emphasized that. And if you put your name there, meaning that you do not pay attention in class. So do not write your names, right? We want to be fair, just indicate your student number. And when you answer these questions, write in an essay style. So you should write complete sentence, and it's not enough just to list keywords or bullet points or fragmented statement, right? And also copy and paste from the slides or the texts from the articles are not enough. You should use your own words, because the goal is for the examiner and the center to know that you understand these corresponding concepts. So if you just copy this corresponding text from the slides, it's hard for us to know whether you understand it, right? So it is important to demonstrate that you understand the corresponding concept and how to apply those concepts. And for some of the important references, you should provide this reference at the end. And usually the style does not matter, but in social science, in management, we prefer this parenthesis author year style, right? And then the grade would be mainly based on your understanding of the course concepts, and including this theory concept framework, right? And also how you apply those theory concept framework to the questions at hand, right? And it is good that you will be able to provide critical reflection and insights, like you could provide different perspectives, because this would convince us that you truly understand this corresponding concept. And last but not least, the communication language is important. We will try to disregard some of the grammatical errors. So it is fine if you make some errors, but because we understand in 4 hours, it's not easy to write perfect sentences. But if your writing is so bad that it's hard for us to understand, then it would influence your grade. So that's something that you should pay attention, right? So some hints: quality matters, not quantity. I mean, if you put all the important points to a certain question, I mean, 1 or 2 paragraphs may be already enough. You do not need to write long, right? So based on our past experiences, the highest grade is usually not given to the one who give the longest answer. To the point is important, right? So do not miss any important point, but once you get the corresponding point clear, you do not need to keep dragging. So you can consider this as explaining some important concept to a friend who are not that familiar with the course material, right? So in order to convince the friends that you know anything and to convince them that your argument is strong enough, you do not need to talk too long, because when they get bored, that's actually not good for your argument. And even though we have cases in the exam, and some of you may be tempted to just try to search for all the relevant information on the case and to get to know everything about the case, but it's not necessary. If you want, you can do it, but we would consider it's mostly a waste of time because all the important information is already given in the case. So just going through the case would be enough for you to answer the corresponding questions. Right? And again, here is a table demonstrating this corresponding grades and also the corresponding description and comments and the conversion between the Danish scale and Chinese scale. Right. And some of you asked about this change management literature and listed rating. So I noticed that because I do not know exactly what the corresponding instructor would cover in different topics, but I checked the topic covered in change management. So maybe, let me show here. So the corresponding slide may not be exactly corresponding to the listed rating, right? So what I recommend you to do is, here is the listed textbook for change management. So if you want to understand these corresponding concepts of mentioned in the slides, you can just go to the textbook and just search this concept. Right? For example, let's say if you want to know this evolutionary or maybe dialectical, right? So if you want to know more about the dialectical view, you can just Google and then go through this corresponding concept that discuss in detail in the textbook. So I will talk to Torben so that he will make this listed reading material consistent with the slides. But now, so what I recommend you to do after today's class and before Friday is just go through these slides. I mean, following this, let me see here. Following this architecture and at least have a brief understanding of this, what these corresponding theories mean and how to apply them. Right? And in case you want to have more understanding of the change management, just go through the textbook by searching these different keywords. Okay, that's all I want to say. And now I'm just ready to take any questions you have.
Maybe one question about the exam itself. In the email we got, it says that we should use our phone to be on Zoom, but because you say we can use internet, is it also fine if we use Zoom with our computer?
I think we should just follow the instructions. I need to check with Dimitri. I think just follow the instructions. So is it too much hassle for you to have the phone and the computer at the same time?
No, it's fine.
Okay, so yeah, I just recommend to follow these instructions. But yeah, of course you are welcome. You could use the internet. And also, it's quite important that you submit this this assignment on time, right? So the exam takes 4 hours, but at the last 10 minutes, it is just for submission time. So make sure that your internet works, because we had in the past year that some students, even though they answered the question very well, but because they failed to submit their assignment, they will not be able to receive a grade. I do not want this to happen to you. I mean, as instructors, as the course coordinator, I always want my student to have good grade, right? So I do not want you to take this extra hassle to take the re-exam. So be careful to make sure that you submit the answer in time. So maybe try, once you are done with the your answer, you can just submit it first. I don't know, you are able to change your submission later, right? That's what I believe, but I need to make sure. So all in all, just make sure that you submit before the time is up. So after the 4 hours, there's 10 minutes extra time for you to submit your assignment. And again, I think I do not need to emphasize this, but make sure you answer all the questions. Do not leave the questions blank. Again, we want you to have a good grade, but if you do not write anything, it's hard for us to judge whether you understand this corresponding concept. I mean, I can tell that as the examiners or graders, we always try to find the points you write to convince us to give you the points. But if you do not write important things, it's hard for us to give you a good grade. So yeah, it's just something that you know, putting yourself into the shoes of the grader or the examiner would help you to determine, you know, what to write there in the exam. Right? So our goal is to evaluate you to make sure that you understand, and you have to show that you understand this corresponding concept to convince us to give you the grades. Okay, so if no further question, I think I'll just stay here for another 5 minutes in case you have any question. Otherwise, I will just stop recording.